Okay, hello, hi everyone, welcome and thank you so much for joining us tonight as we launch a new and selected poems from David Kinloch, Greengown. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jasmine, I'm from Carcanet, and I'm just going to do some housekeeping before we start the event properly. So I'm sure most of you know this by now. We'll be together for an hour this evening. We're joined by David, of course, who is going to read for us. While he's reading, I'm going to have the text up on screen for you as a visual guide. So I just want you to know that you're in charge of your own screen. So if you want the text to be smaller and David to be bigger, just have a play around. And if you have any technical issues during the event, pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to help you as we go through the event. After the reading, David is going to be in conversation with Richard Price, and then there will also be time for audience questions. So as well as finding the chat, please find the chat, please say hello to us, let us know, where you're watching from, what you think of the reading, get involved in the conversation there, but please also find a separate button which says Q&A on it. And if you get your questions for David lined up in there, then Richard can put them to him later on in the event. Thank you all for paying your £2 to be here. We really, really appreciate it. I'll drop the link in the chat now for you, so you can buy a discounted copy of the book, and I'll share that later on as well. So don't rush off and do that right now. I think that's everything. I'm very, very pleased that we're also joined by Richard Price, who is Head of Contemporary British Collections at the British Library. And since 1993, he's published over a dozen books of poetry and been shortlisted for and received many, many major prizes. His most recent collection is a Carcanet classic, which came out last year, The Owner of the Sea, 3 Inuit Stories Retold. So if you don't know his work, please head to our website and check that one out as well. But for now, I'll invite him to join me on screen so that we can begin. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Jazz. And welcome to, it's really a night of celebration, as every new and selected would be. And it's my great privilege to host tonight, partly because the poems are so fine, and partly because it has been my great good fortune to know David since the early 90s. I'm just going to recap a few biographical details. As everyone knows, you can join up biography in all kinds of different ways, like one of those join up puzzles. So don't make too much of it, but I just want to recap a few things that maybe if you don't know already, you should know. David grew up in Glasgow, and from his 20s, he began to move about, whether that was in Paris or in Salford or traveling much further afield, with particular interests in the Caribbean and Canada and Quebec. He was a teacher of French for some time, a lecturer and a scholar of French. You may know that he is an expert on Mallarmé, and also slightly more obscure, but probably no less interesting writer, Joseph Joubert. And that scholarly attention to phenomena is very much part of his poetry. There's a distinct heft to his work, a kind of authority, which I think we should listen to. But perhaps dramatically, I think it's a dramatic shift myself. David moved from the teaching of French to the teaching of creative writing in English. And that was really a very significant leap. He never left other languages behind. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But he eventually arose to become professor of creative writing at Strathclyde. I see David in many different ways, and one way I see him is as a kind of builder, a collaborative builder. And I'm thinking of the landmark magazine Verse, which he co-founded with Robert Crawford and Henry Hart, and which was outstanding in its range. It might have the first feature on language poetry in the UK, one quarter, and it might have an early feature on the new formless poetry the next quarter. It was that kind of magazine, very, very open to the now, to the contemporary, but also thoughtful about aesthetics, keeping that spectrum open, keeping that door, a set of doors, as wide open as possible. Not always easy in perhaps a kind of rehearsal for the culture wars that we've got now. A builder, a co-founder of the Scottish Writers' Centre, chair now of the Edwin Morgan Trust, and responsible as part of that trust for things like the Edwin Morgan Awards. Again, a kind of institution, I suppose, that has kept those doors open, especially to a so-called otherness, especially to non-Anglophone languages, a true sense of curiosity. Now I'll talk a little bit about some of the recognition that David has had. Maybe you don't know about that. There's something very quiet about David. He really is not someone who trumpets too much about himself. But he's a recipient of the R.L. Stevenson Memorial Award, and very recently the recipient of the Cholmondeley Award, which marks the presence of a significant poet. So I also think his presence in the Penguin book of the prose poem is significant. And again, I'll talk about those poetics a little bit later. And again, his presence in the Poetry Archive, the great sound archive of contemporary poetry, and in the Left of Field archive, the archive of the now, speaks to that great range of attention. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the poems, just for a few more minutes before I introduce David himself. As the first in UK poetry to bear sustained witness to the catastrophe of the AIDS crisis, his poetry is unique, historically significant, and also astonishingly mature, to be able to respond in the 1980s and 90s at the time with these works of grace, sometimes anger, and often of richness, was really, it's really quite something. It's something very, very special. And it's clearly also how he constructed his prose poetry poetics. They're based on a queer construction. They are queer prose poems, and that is part of it's part of his achievement. The elegies are striking, but there's also a special playfulness across David's poems. This is a poetry where the megafauna of hippo, of elk, giraffe, walk among very dainty flora, and among the beautifully observed objects of Kinloch's personal history of art. The reader could feel they have, by some amazing luck, found themselves in one of those Italian Renaissance paintings where there's actually attention to the detail of the flora on the floor of the forest, as well as to these amazing torsos. There are touching family portraits here too, and there are testaments to friendship in this selection. The join Kinloch makes between the written, the pictorial, and the spoken, that is fascinating to me. He doesn't know it, maybe he does, he's never said it, but he has been a kind of mentor in aesthetics to me. And so this is a very special occasion for me, as well as I think for you. One theme is the Old Scots language. Now, this is where words in Kinloch's hands they're practically creatures. They feel alive. Maybe they're a kind of state of being. And they're beings or emotions which are poised between the distant past and tomorrow, between those three parameters of reality, voice, and inscription. His word portraits always reclaim and renew. And that could be the accounts of women of the Bible who are not fleshed out in the Bible. They appear as names, or sometimes they're just anonymous. David is interested in that and he wants to write about that. There's the medieval calligrapher, Esther English, the lifelong companions, Baines and Finch, Derek Jarman, and even Mary Queen of Scots. And so it goes on. And in the new work, there's something very fresh and direct in the new work too. Sometimes it's an address to what was happening in the pandemic. Sometimes it's thoughts about ISIS. And these are, if they fold back to the past in Dave's poetry, it's about that amazing ability to respond with layered intelligence to the contemporary. It's almost as if David is slow and fast at the same time. That's a very beautiful and very strange, uncanny quality. And that is why we're here to celebrate David's work. And on that note, I'd like now to pass over to David and just to congratulate him for this achievement.
Hello. Hello, can everybody hear me? I hope you can. Richard, thank you so much for that tremendously generous introduction. I'm speechless. Well, I hope not. It's great to be here, and thanks to Carcanet for putting together such a beautiful book for me, and also for hosting this reading this evening. And it's great to know that so many friends are here listening to me and looking at the screen with me just now. I'm sorry I can't say hi to everybody in person, but a big hi to you all out there. This book, Greengown, collects together the work of over 30 years. The earliest poems were written when I was in my late 20s, and the most recent was written just last year. So I'm going to read some poems from various different stages across those 30 years. And I should perhaps begin by just saying something about the actual title itself. Greengown is one of those old Scots words that Richard was talking about. And it can mean two different things at the same time. On the one hand, one of its definitions is turf or sod on a freshly dug grave. And yet, strangely, it can also mean the loss of virginity in open air. So basically sex and death. And if you were a young man coming of age in the 1980s or the early 1990s, then those things were extraordinarily on the agenda. I found myself living in Paris in 1984-85. It was really the first time that I'd ever lived in a big city, big foreign city for any length of time. It was a period of discovery, a period of coming to terms with myself, with who I was trying to become. And that period coincided with the news that there was a strange disease out there that was affecting gay men. How do you speak about young people who make love and then die as a direct result of that most intimate of acts? How do you write as a gay man in a society in which your full identity is hidden? Well, one of the possible options is to try to find a vocabulary that is queer, that doesn't quite fit. And I found that vocabulary by leafing through the pages of Jameson's Dictionary of the Older Scottish Language. And this first poem is really all about that. It's, as you can see, a prose poem. It's called The Love That Dare Not. Even the illness that extinguishes it comes in borrowed clothes, not one name but many, forming the syntax of your end, unraveling its hidden meanings, sidestepping tears that dare not fall yet because they would admit the last page of this dictionary has been turned. I trace you back, nudging you as I used to, from word to word. The days you called me Rinker, a tall, thin, long-legged horse, a bloody harridan, I called you Rintherout, a gadabout, a needy, homeless vagrant, like the tongue we spoke beneath the sheets. Our life as mobile and happy as the half a dozen Scottish verbs I'd push across a page on Sunday afternoons, trying to select a single meaning. Here it is, under ripple or ripple, a squat paragraph which tells us we must separate the seed of flax from the stalk, undo our badly done work, separate and tear in pieces, and when we are birds must eat grains of standing corn, when clouds open up, disperse, clear off. Its noun has you in its grip, an instrument for rippling flax. Or you might find us under set, which seats, places hens on eggs in order to hatch them, assigns work, settles, gets in order, puts milk into a pan for the cream to rise, sets fishing lines, works according to a pattern, plants potatoes, makes and pells, includes besets, brings to a halt and puzzles, nauseates, disgusts, marks game, lets, leases, sends, dispatches, becomes, suits, beseems, sits, ceases to grow, becomes mature, stiffens, congeals, starts, begins, sets off. The love that dare not, except that now, so near the end, when I would like to hold you, and have been forbidden, I search for it in your eyes, daring their definition. Well, that poem is in a sense about Scots. This next one is in Scots. That previous poem was about Scots words that are no longer alive, that are obsolete. But this next one is written in Glaswegian Scots, a Scots that is very much alive and that I hear around about me every day. This poem is called, this is one of the wee frees, 3 wee frees, and it's called Hinny Pigs. This was in response to an attack that was made by a journalist on LGBTQ people. It was an attack that was made from the perspective of a member of the Free Church of Scotland, hence the title, 3 Wee Frees. And if you're not from these Airts and Pairts, then you should know that your oxters are your armpits, and hinny just is simply honey. Hinny pigs. There was this wee free, right, and he was dozing aft in a pew with the minister going on and on. Sitting on his horns he was, just like at school when he played Hinny Pigs. Hinny Pigs was when one of the boys tried to lift you up by the oxters and gave you 3 shakes. If your horns went off flabby-like, you were a right wersh wee git, and a bench shot into the bargain, a woofter man. If your horns stayed pit, you were a hinny pot or pig, and yous got a shot at the lifting. Well, there was this wee free, right, sitting tight on his horns, scratching his earths as he snoozed, dreaming o' hinny pigs, when all of a sudden, it's Jesus' turn. Aye, Jesus, Christ. He sees Jesus doing some lifting, Jesus, the hinny merchant, feeling for sweet oxters and sour yins. Well, blow me if he didn't choose the biggest hairy hoof of the lot. I'm telling you, his horns were everywhere. Bloody whirligig he was. And the wee free was fair gobsmacked when he jaloused at the guy doing the jack-in-the-box was the wee free hissel, and Jesus saying to him, it's your turn now, son. It's the nippy sweetie's turn. Well, one of the images that remains with me from the 1980s, very strongly with me from the 1980s, was the image of the great AIDS quilt, which was first displayed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in October 1987. What you have to understand is that during the first wave of AIDS, there was so much stigma attached to the disease and so much ignorance. And it was very difficult sometimes for the relatives of people who had lost loved ones to AIDS to actually to get a funeral for them. And sometimes cemeteries even would turn people away. And so the AIDS quilt was created as a way of remembering people who had lost their lives to the disease. The quilt is a great communal work of art, and it is a thing of shreds and patches, and it's the central metaphor of a fairly long sequence of poems. And I'm going to read just a few of those straight through just now. This is called Needlepoint. Injecting your name through this soft quilt with thread as red as blood, I remember my domestic science grades and stop. I try to pass you through the eye, but everything dissolves in water, just as everything is free. I can give you moons or oranges. The words you kept up like spinning plates reinvent your signature. Who will know but me? Now my jongleur is in stitches on this tapestry, and it is your smile I wrap up in this flag. It covers green fields when unfolded, its nations visited by grieving elderly in golf buggies and on bicycles, a thing of shreds and patches, movable Passchendaele. Yet I'm scared that in the night I'll stretch out beneath my quilt and will not find you among the names, and turn to others, tongue-tied, who travel further every year, seeking their own small country. The day of St. Columba. Thursday of St. Columba benign, day to draw up the sheet upon his face, day to zip up the green body bag, day to disinfect his bed, day to discard my plastic gloves, day to collect his personal effects, day to return the oxygen mask, day to sleep and sleep, day to converse with florists, day to phone friends, day of my beloved the Thursday, day of my beloved the Thursday. Here then is my finger lullaby, pushing gently and withdrawing, dolphining upon this quilt, the trough and wave of cotton. I hem your red boat with borders and watch you sail on Washington grass, whipping a green wake beneath you. At dusk, the park attendants rake out your ocean, dandelions, the usual chains of memory, but also unexpected herbs in all the languages we loved. Showy clover for my dusty foot, Clinus libesgrass. Love lies bleeding and live forever, Clinus zittergrass. Each time the needle enters your flank, the pain composes you. Trees that hung your voice among their patterns wrap your quilt in foliage. A dog barks through the branches. A girl's arm passes like an oar across the sunlit patches. Now, your song kneels at the river's edge and will not flow. Your passport head is pinned in silk. So Paris Forfar really was the first book, and it was very much a kind of extended elegy. And once it was finished, I very strongly felt the need to write something that was a bit more upbeat, to be quite frank. And so Un Tour d'Écosse really is modelled on the Tour de France, and it kind of imports a whole bunch of gay writers to Scotland. And shows the gay writers to Scotland and Scotland to the gay writers. So among the stars of that collection are people like Garthia Lorca, Walt Whitman, and also Frank O'Hara. Around about the time, this time I collaborated on a verse play with Donnie O'Rourke and W.N. Herbert. And the idea was really just to kind of tell aspects of O'Hara's life, to celebrate his life and his interests, his francophilia, his gayness, and also obviously his great interest in art. And when I was reading through O'Hara's work in preparation for this, I came across a line in a poem called Alma, "The cockroaches like nuggets half hid in the bran," which made me think of Burns's Ode to a Mouse. And so this next poem I'm going to read is To a Bardie. Fair cockroach on jumping out of a New York fridge and confronting him, July 1997. So it's really an ode to Frank O'Hara. Huge, balded, chittering, timorous Bardie, open in the fridge was richt foo hardy. Wheel michty, fart a wama lairdy, wi Christ, a cockroach. I would just love to run and chase thee, wi murder and reproach. Welcome to my sweltering bothy, this liftless scraper, clammy, growthy. It cracks me up to see you drouthy. Tough. I've drunk the beer, munched the bran O'Hara slipped, say poofy like in here. Which parts would you hae me play? James Dean. Your freen fancied him enough, the lean, cute, saft smoulder of his outcast een. Jessie Rebel. What cause is worth a nicht in mean Cockroach Hotel? Aye, right. My Bronx bodywork's a smash in motion. My brow a buckled dashboard, twitching, sniffing the stashed hash o' my good cousin, hit and run gecko wi Groucho Tash, Corleone's chin. Or wad it be Ginger? Wee Tom Cruise, paddy doing wi Mel, whose fuse is too short for his kilt. You choose. Brief encounter? No brief enough for me. Say muse on, Lana Turner. You'd like to find a symbol in me. In this dreich hole am Cocteau's repartee, fleur du mal sooking up the ennui o' being you, core of the big apple's bel esprit, twad mak me spew. Frank grew out o' this, and all the folk he toasted wi his can o' coke, Grace, Patsy, Warren, Kenneth Coke, suffered nae sea change, rising fi Fire Island waves, soaked, mair themselves, strange. Just a cockroach in a New York fridge, you've writ a poem to, nae bridge to something bigger in mysel, abridged myth, camp and free. You're the one gaze on his nerve, on edge, in tongues, no me. I know that we're running, we don't have a huge amount of time this evening, so I'm going to kind of skip forward now, both in terms of the decades. What a horrible thought, skipping through the decades. So moving forward in time to, a couple of more recent poems. This is a poem that I think has a certain amount of political resonance. It's about refugees, about immigrants, and of course they are very much in the news at the present moment. And this poem is called Text. If you can find that, Jazz, yeah. And so this is really about my encounter with a refugee, and I should explain the reference in the first line to Scruff. Scruff is a social media platform used by gay men. Text. Mohammed texts me on Scruff from Alexandria. I mention Cavafy and he asks me when I'll visit. I think of Egypt, Shakespeare. Never, I reply. It's too far. Then I clock he means the one in Western Bartonshire and blush. Cavafy was Greek, he says. I'm Syrian and a refugee. Constantine Cavafy would have known just what to say then from his careful room. He dealt in exiles mainly, some refugees, and had a knack for letting the window veil blow back at the turn of a line, so we can see young Anthony glint briefly from his high abandoned tower block, sense his fate blow out among the second-best streets of a second-hand city. Mohammed is waiting for me to reply as I write this poem. It is 19.25 miles from Glasgow to Alexandria. And then this next poem, which again has Cavafy associations, since it borrows the title of one of Cavafy's most famous poems, Ithaca. Once the great statues lined the Silk Road. Their names were Goddess, Lion, Funerary Weeping Girl, Merchant with beard like an abacus. Pristine and worn from the wonderful journey, they spoke of their fine minds, the excitement of time travel, without moving a single stone muscle. They did not fear the bazaar of generations which milled at their feet and glanced up shiftily from age to age. Who could bear them? Not us, not anymore. With their high-mindedness, their competence, their curled, cropped hair, we cropped them. Down they came, the many into the one, the rubble, because at heart they are stone. And that poem, of course, was written in response to the destruction by ISIS of Palmyra in Syria. I'm going to end with just one final poem. And this is a poem really which was written during lockdown, during the pandemic, and it's called Mystic Nativity. Yeah, obviously during the pandemic, we were prevented from going to art galleries, from going to churches, from meeting our friends. It made me think a great deal about friendship itself. And I suppose, at the heart of one of the simplest images really relating to all of that was the simple handshake, the embrace. We weren't allowed to shake hands with people. We weren't allowed to embrace others. And this poem really is about that. I was browsing online and I came across Botticelli's Mystic Nativity, which seemed to me to be a fairly standard representation of that subject. And then when I looked at the foreground, right at the very bottom of the painting, I could see some tiny little red devils with little forked tails. But they weren't glaring at the spectator. They were embracing each other. They were shaking hands. Mystic Nativity. If an angel stopped in the lane before our barn or the turreted castle and turned to embrace me, oh, the hugs, oh, the stopping and stopping. I would brush aside wings and shake his hand. I would dance all the friendly angels out of their domes, their stables. Why, even the 7 small devils clasp crestfallen hands before heading to hell. May I turn to you then, as the child in the manger turns from his swaddling shroud, and unfold the wings of your palms like a gamp. You remember the loosening rain, the dull earthly weather, how we shared the braille of our lifelines, those touching gifts. Was this in our lifetime? Now, loose the arm from the shoulder, the right one, the left one. Remember the hand. Cross the painting's meridian just into the lane by the barn. Thank you for listening.
And thank you, David, for a beautiful reading, beautifully paced. And it's so good to hear the range of poems. I've heard you read, not many, but several, more than several times, and over the years, and it's great to hear the range again. Congratulations on Greengown.
Thank you very much.
Now it's my job to be the questioner.
The inquisitor.
I paused. It's also my job to invite questions from the audience. So I've got questions, but you too can ask questions, and you do that by using the Q&A button. I'll keep an eye on chat as well, but you can do that, folks in the audience, by using the QA session button, and I'll keep an eye on that. In the meantime, my first question is really about the selected. So, how on earth did you separate the goats from the sheep? It's a time of reflection, a time of winnowing. I'm getting all Ecclesiastes now. How did you do it? What were your framing thoughts? And also, how did it feel?
Well, there were kind of two main issues, I suppose. I mean, it took me about 1.5 years to do this, and when I set out, I didn't expect it to take nearly that length of time. So, in a sense, it was a process of surprise and discovery. It was made difficult by the fact that I'm the kind of writer who tends to write books of poems rather than collections of poems. And what I mean by that simply is that most of my books have kind of arguments. I don't mean by that they have a beginning and a middle and an end. It's not that they're kind of telling a continuous story or anything like that. But they do. To me, it feels as if they have an argument to make. And so selecting from, say, the book of elegies that I wrote for my late father, for example, selecting from that I found really quite difficult to do, because in selecting that you run the risk of violating the whole that you work so hard to create. And I think that, you know, I made that distinction between a book and a collection, a book of poems and a collection of poems. And I think probably most poets, when they're putting together a collection, would feel that this is an important issue. Obviously, we're all interested in trying to create interesting structures, but I think this is something that has been particularly important for me. I was very struck as an undergraduate when I read that Baudelaire had said of Les Fleurs du Mal that it has a secret architecture. And I kind of feel the same about quite a few of my books. So that made it hard to select. The other thing was what you touched on earlier. I wanted to, my first book, Paris Forfar, has been long out of print. And I wanted to include quite a lot of poems from that first book, partly because I think it does have some value as a kind of historical document. And yeah, those were the kind of, so those were two of the main things that I was thinking about in relation to all of this. And obviously that impacted on selection from later, more recent volumes. I couldn't include everything I wanted to include, obviously, although I have to say Carcanet have been very generous, giving me the space that I felt I needed. In terms of how it made me feel, yes, you as you go back through your work, you recognize a shape. I think a shape begins to form. You obviously recognize recurring obsessions. I think it's dangerous, though. That has its dangers, its own dangers, because during the course of that process, you can recognize the shape of a book emerging, and then latch onto that too quickly and impose it on top of all the other kind of choices that you have to make. And so you can end up actually skewing the book in a direction that perhaps it shouldn't necessarily be going in, if you see what I mean. I haven't expressed that very well, but that was something else that plagued me when I was trying to put all of this together.
I think I see what you mean. I think it's a bit like commissioning yourself.
Yeah.
Which is a slightly difficult thing to do. It can actually drive you to find a pattern.
Yes.
But is that really what you should do? The collection might not breathe so well that way. Of course, I think you managed it.
Well,
I've got favourites that I wanted in that book, and they're not in there. But as a whole, it's a beautiful, beautiful book. So I want to now go back again to that first big book, Paris Forfa. I just want to sort of underline the fact that it was just so hard to get that work of testimony published and received, and no one else was doing that. It is a landmark of a book, and I think that should just be acknowledged. And this, to me, that's one of the things this book does. But I also want to talk about aesthetics. So I'm going to have to look at my notes for this. So just bear with me. So to me, when we read these poems, we see an approach that at times has a very direct lyrical approach, and at times there's a really paratactical one. It doesn't follow a single line. It layers as the book goes through. A secret architecture is a really good phrase to use. That seems to me a way of you keeping these the polar coordinates and occupying the space between them. Really, really important aesthetic work as well as political work. What I'd like you to talk a bit more about is the immediate context. So if I'm right, and it was a long time ago, so I could be quite wrong about this, you were in Paris, you were in the middle of a decade of literary theory tumult. I mean, these were the poetic philosophers, Derrida and Barthes, and even Baudrillard is poetic in a kind of shocking way. Is that part of the context for you? And how do you see that affecting the architecture of the poems in that period of the work?
Yes, well, I was a lecturer at the École Normale in Paris in 83, 84. So I was teaching English language to French students, some of whom were not much younger and not much older than myself, or younger than myself, and at that time. Derrida was briefly on the staff. I remember visits to the École by poets associated with the magazine L'Éphémère, people like André de Bouchet, Jacques Dupin, Yves Bonnefoy. It was, as you say, a kind of high point in post-structuralist literary theory. All of that was going on at that time. So that was the kind of general background, the general context. Yes, there are direct lyrical poems, some of which I've read this evening in that first sequence, but there's also more complex work about language, like some of the prose poetry, and I read one of those. On one hand, there was the raw immediacy of the fact that young men of my generation were making love and dying. And on the other hand, there was the highly ironized philosophy of post-structuralism, which kind of problematizes the existence of a lyric subject. I remember that in 1985, Douglas Dunn published his book of elegies for his first wife, Leslie. And that was a book I really admired. And I still do admire it. But I remember feeling that there was no way that I could possibly write a book of elegies in that kind of way, in that very lyrical way, that because of the nature of the disease itself, AIDS is it's a rhizomatic disease. You know, it's a network of competing infections, and I felt that in order to reflect the reality, that kind of reality, then it had to be both lyrical but also much more, I used the word paratactic, I think, much more oblique, much more meta, perhaps, even in its approach. I don't know if that if that answers your question.
I think that's incredibly helpful. I think the example of the closeness of Donne's elegies and their distance, that's a really, really helpful example. So thanks. My next question is to do with a figure which pops up through your work, and that is the figure of Dustyfoot. Now, I suppose many poets have a kind of, is it a doppelganger, or is it a kind of favourite idea embodied in a person? I think of Edwin Morgan's Cinque Valle, well, he's a kind of Polish-German acrobat with Italian connections. That's another story, but his skill in juggling. Dustyfoot isn't really like that. Dustyfoot is a traveller, maybe a chapman, maybe a teller and collector of stories. I'm not sure. Well, don't let me explain. You explain.
Okay.
Tell me more about Dustyfoot.
Okay, so, well, Dustyfoot was a word before it became a character, and one of the nice things about Dustyfoot is that he very obligingly translates himself back into a quintessential kind of wordiness when I'm not looking, and sometimes when I am looking. He kind of facilitates a kind of lexical heft, a thisness. He's got an explicit meta dimension. You know, he both scoffs at himself. He's very skeptical about his own existence, his own reality, but at the same time, he looks out at the reader and tries to seduce the reader, tries to make the reader believe that he himself actually is real. You know, for me, he's a kind of Whitrick-like figure. You know, that weasel-like character that Edwin Morgan writes about, that kind of flash of energy in language itself that resolves, or perhaps doesn't quite resolve, into story and character. Yeah, he's Scott O'Vagans. He's the wandering Scot. He's the juggler. He doesn't have a home of his own, but home is constantly on his lips. He's me. He's not me. He's like that giraffe in clown's clothing on the cover of the book. Now, you're going to have to forgive me for a minute, because I'm going to have to bend down and pick up a wire and plug in my computer. Otherwise, I'm going to disappear from the screen altogether. So bear with me just 1 second.
Well, meanwhile, I can look at the question and answer.
Good, we're safe again. We're safe again, it's fine.
Now, there has been one question from the audience, and I'm just going to read it, partly because I don't completely understand it, and maybe you. So this is from Richard Soar, and it is, "Where to taketh your poetic event horizon?" Now,
Where am I heading? You mean, where am I heading?
I think that's what it means. I think that's what it means. No offense to Richard. I think that's what it means.
Hi, Richard. It sounds just like you. Where's my poetry heading? What does the future hold? Well, you know, if I could answer that question, then I don't think there would be very much hope for me, because I don't plan things. I don't plan poetry in that sort of a way. Well, you know, that's not 100% true. I believe that poetry is a way of finding out things about the world that I didn't already know. poetry is a form of research, of lyrical, intellectual research. And so, yes, I take back what I just said. I am, in fact, planning another poem. I am doing some research towards what might become a poem, but I'm pretending that I'm not. I'm busy lying to everybody, as I've just lied to you, in the hope that I might kid the muse into thinking that that she alone is the sole inspiration for this magnum opus that will magically emerge from my head at some stage in the future.
There really is something jinxy about saying what you're doing.
Yeah.
I recognize that, and I also, if I said I'm working on something, sometimes I think I've done it, and it will never get done. It's like the concept poem. Oh yes, I've done that poem. I haven't written it. Of course, I haven't written it. Yes, I think there is something jinxy about that. Now, I suppose this brings me to another question, which I think is about the future, or at least the future is one leg of the question. The other leg is, well, it's to do with the Scots language. So you're using Scots in a really different way when you are excavating very ancient, arcane Scots words. You made the point very clearly in your reading about how alive Scots is. Glasgow is a Scots city. How are you? Can you say more about how the different types of Scots play out in your work?
Yes. Well, yeah. My relationship with Scots isn't straightforward. Scots was a big presence in my adolescence through my grandfather, who was a poet and who wrote somebody who wrote his best work in Scots. His name was William Jeffrey, but he died in 1946. But he was kind of held up to me as he was almost a kind of hero figure, so I was always curious about Scots from that kind of very early age. But you know, I'm a good middle class boy, as they say. I don't naturally speak any form of Scots other than standard Scottish English, but I was brought up in Glasgow, listening to the speech of working class Glasgow all around me, Glaswegian Scots. So I feel betwixt and between. I've always felt betwixt and between when it comes to Scots. I've always been slightly wary of writing direct, so-called original poems in Scots, because I've felt that to some extent it's a kind of an act of ventriloquism. I have done it from time to time, and I've tried to do it when I have done that, I've tried to do it with love and respect. But it doesn't quite feel mine. It doesn't quite feel as if it's my voice. It's as if when I write Scots, I'm trying to negotiate a voice that isn't mine, but isn't Scots with a capital S as well, if that makes sense. Yeah. Scots is like an older big brother for me, somebody that I tremendously envy and desire, but I know I'll never quite be like him, and I'll never quite live up to him. And I think that all of that's come together and enabled me to experiment a bit with Scots. And yes, writing about Scots in the way that I've done is perhaps a little unusual, but you know, Scots writing, it's the kingdom of experimentation, really. The history of writing in Scots. I feel that writing in Scots has never been anything but experiment. Where there is no accepted standard, there is a greater permission. And I think it's up to everybody who loves the sounds of Scots to seize the opportunity and write as they can in it.
So I can also feel the class anxiety there.
Yes,
which I share, and also have other complications I don't want to go into tonight. But there's clearly an interest in another language, and there's this question from Chiara Tixi. Do you think your extended knowledge of other languages, namely across other forms of official languages, such as Québécois for French, gives something more and different to your poetry and to your creative process?
That's a good question. Yes, I mean, I think I spent an awful long time helping students to understand a foreign language, translating backwards and forwards between French and English, and Québécois French and English, for that matter as well. And when you have that daily experience of translation work of that kind, I think it broadens your horizons. It simply makes you it sensitizes you to a greater acoustic range. Yeah, I think that's what I would say initially.
There's so much more to explore, David, and I think the end note on sensitivity is a good one. But I'm sorry that we're now running out of time. So I think I would just like to thank you for tonight, for a really beautiful reading, for answering the questions so openly and thoughtfully, but also for these decades of poetry. It's just been a marvel to read them over the years and to see them celebrated in this new collection.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you to everybody else for listening and for your questions as well. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
I just want to thank you guys as well. Thank you both. It's been such a pleasure. I can't believe it's been an hour already. And congratulations, David. Yes, it's been great to share this with you. So thank you guys all for being here. And thank you again for paying your £2. We do really appreciate your support. The link is in the chat for you to go and buy your copy of the book. And it's nearly Christmas, so you can buy a few more with your £2 off. It'll come with an email as well tomorrow, so don't worry about doing that immediately. And if you have any problems getting the book or using the code, just get in touch with me and I will help you. So the final thing to be said is please join us again. Next week, we're launching a new collection from Jeffrey Wainwright, and he's going to be talking to John McAuliffe about it. So that's also in the chat for you, and hopefully we'll see you there. So thank you guys, and congratulations, David.